The Sportsman Heritage Act of 2012. This dates back to the Wilderness Act of 1964. It is described as a way to promote hunting and fishing on public lands, but a CRS report finds it may clear the way for motorized vehicles and new roads in wilderness areas. Thanks for watching today. We'll be back tomorrow.
Recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this past Saturday, the Food Network premiered their first ever documentary called Hunger Hits Home. This powerful program showed the struggle that millions of Americans go through just to put food on their tables. I urge my colleagues, indeed all Americans, to watch it by going to foodnetwork.com and searching for Hunger Hits Home. It's fitting that the Food Network, a cable network that focuses on cooking, would choose to highlight the scourge of hunger with its first documentary. That's because food is at the heart of the problem. While 435 members of Congress and 100 senators will never have to worry about going hungry, there are nearly 49 million people who struggle each year to put food on their table. 17 million kids each year go hungry in America, and those numbers are getting worse, not better. The Food Network aired this documentary because of the hard work of good people at Share Our Strength. Led by my good friend Billy Shore, Share Our Strength is a leader in the fight to end child hunger, and this effort wouldn't be where it is today without them. We have more than enough food in America to feed everyone. We also have the delivery systems to ensure that food gets to those people who need it. The problem is politics. We have the means, the food, and the programs to ensure that not one person goes without food in this country. What we lack, Mr. Speaker, is the political will to actually make it happen. We should remember that while there is a cost to ending hunger, the cost of doing nothing is so much more. According to a report from the Center for American Progress and Brandeis University, hunger costs America more than $261 billion each year. That's billion with a B. Specifically, hunger costs, and I quote, at least $167.5 billion due to the combination of lost economic productivity per year, more expensive public education because of the rising costs of poor education outcomes, avoidable health care costs, and the cost of charity to keep families fed. This $167.5 billion does not include the cost of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and the other key federal nutrition programs, which run at about $94 billion a year. We call this $167.5 billion America's hunger bill. In 2010, it cost every citizen $542 due to the far-reaching consequences of hunger in our nation. At the household level, the hunger bill came to at least $1,410 in 2010. And because our $167.5 billion estimate is based on a cautious methodology, the actual cost of hunger and food insecurity to our nation is probably higher. And I end the quote. $167.5 billion, that's a lot of money. It's a staggering amount. Yet we continue to ignore those costs and allow hunger to grow in America. We know that hunger would be even worse in this country if it weren't for programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, the school meal programs, and other federal anti-hunger programs. These programs are literally a lifeline for millions of hungry children, parents, and seniors. I believe that we can end hunger in America if we muster the political will to do so. Fighting hunger has traditionally been a bipartisan effort. Unfortunately, the Republican leadership in this House is pushing an agenda that will actually make hunger worse in America. Tomorrow, the Agriculture Committee will mark up legislation that cuts $33 billion from the most important anti-hunger program we have in this country. SNAP is a program that not only provides food to low-income parents, seniors, and children, it also provides a most effective form of economic stimulus, and it actually reduces poverty. Yet the Republican leadership continues to demagogue the program as wasteful, as fraudulent, and as something that is growing out of control. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, SNAP is among the most effective and efficient federal programs. The truth is that the SNAP error rate is around 3%. That error rate includes people who do not receive the benefit that they are actually entitled to. I challenge anyone to find me a Defense Department program with an error rate as low as 3%. I look forward to the time when the Republican leadership stops using hunger as a wedge issue and lets this become a bipartisan issue once again. I understand that we need to balance the budget, Mr. Speaker, but must it be on the backs of the poor and the most vulnerable in our country? Hunger Hits Home, this wonderful film, shows us the problem facing this nation. The challenge is presented to us. Are we going to end hunger once and for all or not? So far, the answer from the Republican leadership is a resounding no, and I regret very much that decision. Mr. Speaker, hunger is a political condition. If we muster the political will, we can end it once and for all. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just say before I actually get started, we just saw the space shuttle fly over on the back of a 747, and I salute the end of an amazing era in space exploration, and I look forward to the next day of NASA being able to talk about space exploration and how we're going to get out there so we don't have to rely on Russians to get to space to continue to do what I think is a very important role of the federal government. I was in Houston, and I actually went through the NASA Center here about 3 or 4 days ago, but I was in Houston for military duty. I am a pilot in the Air National Guard. I fly an airplane called an RC-26, which is a reconnaissance plane. I did 9 days of duty, and what we did is we were in Texas flying missions on the border of Mexico in order to help Border Patrol secure that border to ensure that those people that want to come in here legally, and just as importantly, if not more importantly, to ensure that the drug trade is not being brought into our country, to reduce the amount of drugs being brought in from Mexico, as well as to ensure that terrorists are not making their way through the border by sneaking in through that border of Mexico. Now, before I went, I expected to see a border that was basically secure, because that's what I've been hearing from the administration, that the border is basically secure. Yeah, there are examples of people coming across outside of that, but for the most part, it's pretty good to go. Well, what I saw was something completely different. You know, I'm going to tell you just a quick story about somebody who's on the border every day trying to protect this country against drugs and against terrorism coming through that border. This guy, as a Border Patrol agent, affectionately is the word, known as Uzi. Uzi is a former Marine. He was a Marine for about 5 years, started a small business when he got out of the Marine Corps, and made the decision that, you know what, he wants to go continue to serve and protect his country. Now, I flew missions with Uzi. He was on board my aircraft as we went down and we looked for these, we assisted Border Patrol. And the one thing Uzi said to me is, Congressman, look, we're out here every day in the heat, in the sweltering sun, trying to continue to protect this country. Make sure you give us what we need here. And when you hear about the stories of how hamstrung they are from actually enforcing the border and how there are many tools available to them that they're not allowed to use, it's actually pretty sad. Now, look, we want to be a nation of immigration. We want to be a nation of legal immigration. But one thing we don't want to be is a nation that wakes up one day and finds out that there was another terrorist attack in a major United States city, and that potentially that weapon of mass destruction or those terrorists actually came in through an unsecure border with Mexico. Now, I went down there really believing that there was a fence along the line, and I saw nothing of the kind in southern Texas. Let's tell the American people the truth. The truth is, we want to be a nation that respects immigration, because most of us here actually are immigrants removed ourselves. But we want to be a nation that has a legal process to do it. And when we have an open border, we're encouraging people to go around that legal process, and we're opening ourselves up to attack. Let's stand together. Let's say to respect the immigration and the immigrant history of this country, but let's do it in a legal way. My eyes were opened as I did military duty on the border to the fact that we have a long way to go. This can be a bipartisan issue. It doesn't need to be Republican versus Democrat, but it needs to be something that we actually finally do. And we stand together and we say we'll be a nation that is safe once and for all. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the deadline for filing tax returns. Even though we were given 2 extra days this year, we are running out of time for the tax code. The tax system doesn't generate enough money for what America needs and spends today. It's getting more expensive every year to continue the huge array of tax breaks, even as the code itself becomes more unfair, complex, and inefficient. It costs over $160 billion a year for Americans just to comply with the tax code. The path forward should be simple. First, we should stop making the code more complex, which sadly the Republican plan working its way forward will do with $50 billion of additional unfocused tax breaks. At least if we're going to borrow another $50 billion from the Chinese, we should use it to fund job-creating infrastructure. For instance, that $50 billion would enable us to fund a multi-year transportation reauthorization. We should also repeal the pernicious alternative minimum tax. It was once designed as a tax on very rich people who didn't pay taxes. Today, no billionaire hedge fund manager pays the alternative minimum tax. Instead, it falls on upper middle income families, especially those who pay a lot of taxes. Every year we find some creative way to avoid the consequence of it not being indexed for inflation. Every year we find some way to have a fix, to have a patch, to avoid its full impact. Unless somehow there is a complete breakdown in the political process, which sadly is not impossible, as we saw this last year with the FAA reauthorization. If that were to happen, then at least the full fury of 20 to 30 million of upper middle income and middle income households who would be forced to pay it, they would force it to be repealed. We should combine the alternative minimum tax repeal with the imposition of the so-called Buffett rule, where millionaires at least pay as much as the people who answer their phones and drive them to work. This will get back to the original intent of the alternative minimum tax, but in a way that simplifies the tax code rather than further complicating it. We should stop the dangerous practice of suspending some of the payroll tax in the name of economic stimulus. We are uncomfortably close to destabilizing the long-term funding mechanism for Social Security. Instead of the payroll tax cut, let's target a tax credit for lower and middle-income families that will be fair, affordable, and help nurture our fragile economic recovery without threatening the long-term Social Security stability. We should target for elimination tax breaks that are out of date, like the subsidy of oil that doesn't reflect current production techniques or the reality of global petroleum markets. We should instead protect subsidies that are key for our future, especially expiring renewable energy tax credits. We should renew the Section 1603 Treasury Grant Program, which reflects current market realities and would actually be less expensive than traditional tax credits. On this tax day, we should look for some progress towards building momentum for real tax reform. The Romney Republican House budget refuses to identify any of the massive tax increases that will be necessary to meet their plan of even more tax cuts for the rich and not increase the deficit. With $4 trillion in expiring tax provisions later this year, we should use some of that economic capacity to make the tax system more fair, simple, while we reduce the debt. The time to begin that process is now. Not making the tax code more complex, not favoring those who need help the least, not risking long-term Social Security funding, and not borrowing for unfocused new tax relief. Instead, let's deal with investments like renewable energy and infrastructure. Let's use some of this budget capacity to reduce the overall corporate tax rate while broadening the base and closing loopholes. Simpler, fairer, better for business. Let's eliminate the tyranny of the alternative minimum tax, protect our energy future, support renewables and there is a path forward that we should start on now. What better way to honor American taxpayers on filing day than getting serious with an agenda that can actually be achieved and should be?
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, a defining aspect of the American tradition is that groups of citizens band together for a wide variety of civic purposes. They recruit volunteers, raise funds, and spend those funds to promote whatever project or cause brings them together. For more than a century, our tax laws have recognized that such voluntary associations, nonprofits as we call them today, should not be taxed because their proceeds are devoted entirely to improve our communities through education and advocacy and civic action. Section 501 of the Internal Revenue Code recognizes them today, and civic groups as diverse as MoveOn.org, the League of Conservation Voters, the ACLU, the National Rifle Association, and various taxpayer groups have always been included in this definition. We don't apply a political test to these civic groups. We recognize the fundamental right of Americans to organize and to pool their resources to promote whatever causes they believe in, left or right. Indeed, whatever their political persuasion, these civic groups perform an absolutely indispensable role in our democracy by raising public awareness, defining issues, educating voters, promoting reforms, holding officials accountable, and petitioning their government to redress grievances. Abolition, women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, all would have been impossible without them. In order to be recognized as nonprofit groups, these organizations must register with the IRS, a purely ministerial function that in the past has been applied evenly and without regard to their political views, at least until now. It seems that Tea Party groups are today being treated very differently than their counterparts on the political left. For the last 2 years, many have been stonewalled by the IRS when they've sought to register as nonprofits, and most recently, they have been barraged with increasingly aggressive and threatening demands vastly outside the legal authority of the IRS. Indeed, the only conceivable purpose of some of these demands is to intimidate and harass. A Tea Party group in my district is typical of the reports that we are now hearing across this country. This group submitted articles of incorporation as a nonprofit to the state of California, and they received approval within a month. But then they tried to register as a nonprofit with the IRS. Despite repeated and numerous inquiries, the IRS stonewalled this group for 1.5 years, at which time it demanded thousands of pages of documentation and gave the group less than 3 weeks to produce it. The IRS demanded the names of every participant at every meeting held over the last 2 years, transcripts of every speech given at those meetings, what positions they had taken on issues, the names of their volunteers and donors, and copies of communications they'd had with elected officials, and on and on. Perhaps most chilling of all, the organizer of this particular group soon found herself the object of a personal income tax audit by the IRS. Mr. Speaker, these are groups of volunteers who pass the hat at meetings to pay for renting the hall. They give of their own time to research issues and pay out of their own pockets for printing flyers. The donations made to them aren't tax deductible, so there is no legitimate purpose in asking for the names of their donors, let alone of their volunteers, unless, and this is the fine point of it, unless the purpose is to harass and intimidate. Ironically, the same tactics we now see used by the IRS against Tea Parties were once used by the most abusive of the southern states in the 1950s to intimidate civil rights groups like the NAACP. No such tactics have been reported by similar civic groups on the political left, so the conclusion is inescapable, that this administration is very clearly, very pointedly, and very deliberately attempting to intimidate, harass, and threaten civic-minded groups with which they disagree, using one of the most feared and powerful agencies of the United States government to do so. Mr. Speaker, these facts speak for themselves. They need no embellishment or interpretation. They should alarm every American of goodwill, regardless of political philosophy, for this precedent is allowed to stand. No one's freedom is safe. I bring these facts to the attention of the House today and ask that they be rigorously investigated and, if found accurate, that those officials responsible be exposed, disgraced, dismissed, and debarred from any further position of trust or power within our government.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Speaker. I wish to address the House for 5 minutes, revised and extended.
Gentleman's recognized without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in 74 days, this Congress may well hang a financial albatross around the necks of students and families across this country. That's because on July 1st, student interest rates are scheduled to go from 3.4% to 6.8%, literally doubling the interest costs that our kids and their parents are going to have to pay on their education. We have got to find a way, Republicans and Democrats, to work together and avoid this punishing interest rate increase on our students. This is not about Republicans or Democrats. It's not about red states or blue states. It's not about the 2012 elections. It's about the kids that we all represent. It's about the parents that we all represent. In my case, in the state of Vermont, it's about students like Michael McGurk, who is a freshman at the University of Vermont, and he literally doesn't know whether he's going to be able to go on in college if the interest rates double. It's about parents like Ben Truman and Jennifer Wallace Brodeur, who last month were sitting around the table with their son about to go to college and trying to put the pieces together to be able to afford it. What this also is about is ground zero for the middle class. This country faces a very fundamental question. Are we a country, are we a Congress that is going to remain committed to expanding and broadening the middle class, making it possible for low-income folks to climb their way into the middle class, making it possible for folks in the middle class to stay there? In order to do that, we have to invest in the future, and that means making it possible, making it affordable for our kids to get the education they need to get that start. Student debt in this country is at a crisis point. At $900 billion, student debt outpaces that of credit cards, outpaces that of auto loans, and there's no end in sight. In Vermont, nearly 70% of our college graduates, and again, this has nothing to do with what their political affiliation is. 70% of our college students in Vermont graduate with debt about $30,000. That's real money. That's more than many of those students will make in their first years out of college. It's a tough job market. In their entry-level jobs, don't pay a lot. Students are totally at the mercy of a system that's out of control. The average tuition at four-year public universities rose by over 8% last year, so costs are going up even as student aid is going down. And a recent poll found that 75% of Americans viewed college as unaffordable. That can't be something that we allow to continue. People need to have confidence that that ticket to the middle class is there and it's affordable. That's why we together have to find a way to avoid this doubling of interest rates. For over 8 million students in this country, Stafford loans are a very critical resource helping them afford the cost of that college education we all want them to get. You know, with the federal government now borrowing money at close to 2%, why are we asking middle-class families to pay 6.8%? These are not grants. These are loans. They'll be repaid. Let's find a way to help our kids and to help our parents. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Like my colleagues in the House, I was home for the last 2 weeks on our Easter break, and it continues to amaze me why we in Congress do not listen to the American people. I represent the 3rd Congressional District of North Carolina, the home of Camp Lejeune Marine Base, Cherry Point Marine Air Station, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, and over 60,000 retired veterans. not one person said to me, we need to stay in Afghanistan. I'm not exaggerating, Mr. Speaker. Everyone that I saw and had a conversation with, and the issue of Afghanistan came up in the conversation, said, get out now. That's why I wanted to be on the floor today, because the administration keeps saying, well, 2014, and yesterday driving back to D.C., I was listening to C-SPAN, and I heard an interview with Secretary Panetta and General Dempsey, and I have a lot of respect for both men, but it was kind of vague when Secretary Panetta said to the reporter that asked him plans for 2014, well, you know, we're hoping that we can train the Afghans to stabilize their own country. Mr. Speaker, I say this respectfully, that's an iffy proposition at best. In a recent Washington Post ABC News poll, only 30% of the American people say the war has been worth fighting. The citizens of this country are tired of sending their loved ones to die for a country we have not been able to change in a decade. I'll even go and say this, it has never changed in the history of Afghanistan going back to Alexander the Great. So why are we still there? Well, again, people say, well, we got to stabilize the country. We can't even stabilize America's economy. And sometimes it gets a little bit ridiculous when I look at all the money being spent overseas, and particularly in a country like Afghanistan, and we say to the people of East and North Carolina and the people in the 50 states, we don't have money to fix your infrastructure. But yet, Mr. Karzai, you're a corrupt leader, and we're proud to keep sending you $10 billion a month. Talking about Mr. Karzai brings me to an editorial written by Eugene Robertson, a syndicated columnist, and it's titled, Afghanistan, an Indefensible Cost. And I feel that Mr. Robertson, who wrote this in 2010, could be writing it right now in 2012, and it would have even more meaning. And I quote from the column. This is from Mr. Karzai. The time has come to reduce military operations. The time has come to reduce the presence of, boots in Afghanistan, to reduce the intrusiveness into the daily Afghan lives. This is what President Karzai said to the Washington Post. Well, in his column in 2010 that he could be writing today, April 2012, this is what Mr. Robertson said in response to Karzai. All right, then, let's save American lives and a ton of money. Let's oblige him. Mr. Robertson, thank you. I hope that this Congress, when we debate the DOD bill in May, and we have amendments from both sides saying that we must have a more defined end to this involvement in Afghanistan, I hope and pray that we will pass some of these legislative amendments. Mr. Speaker, I brought with me today, I've got so many of these posters of a tragic scene of a soldier, Marine, Airman, Navy, whatever it might be, in a coffin going to his or her grave. That brings me to my last point, The Body of War, a production by Phil Donahue and Maria Spiro. I'm going to be talking more about this because this young man is paralyzed from his breast down and what he has to go through to live. This Congress needs to meet its constitutional responsibility. Any other involvement by our country needs to be a declaration of war. Mr. Robertson, thank you again, and I close. God, please continue to bless our men and women in uniform, the families of our men and women in uniform, the wounded and their families. And God, please continue to bless America. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning with good news and bad news. This news comes by way of my hometown newspaper, the Houston Chronicle, and I'm proud that they have printed and published the news that I'm about to share with the public. The bad news is that Mr. Yandell Johnson was accosted and beaten on the streets of Houston, Texas, simply because of his race. Simply because of his race. This is bad news for anyone in our great country, a country that believes in liberty and justice for all. This is bad news. The good news, however, is they were prosecuted and they were convicted in a federal court pursuant to the James Byrd hate crime law. And I'm honored to tell you that that law passed here in this Congress in 2009 and was signed into law. It is properly styled the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act. It was supported by many people and organizations expressing goodwill. The NAACP supported it. The ADL supported it, and many others supported this law. A good many members of this Congress supported it. This law allowed the prosecution to take place in a federal court when these men, 3 of them, would have been charged in a state court and, if convicted, faced misdemeanor charges. In this, the greatest country in the world, no one should have to fear for life or liberty simply because of who you are, simply because of your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your sexuality. It shouldn't happen in this country. The truth is that in this case there was some testimony with reference to one of the defendants having dated a person of African ancestry. There was testimony that he did not appear to be the kind of person that would be considered a white supremacist. But here is another truth that we have to deal with. The truth is that there is confusion about the hate crime law. There's a misunderstanding. This law does not allow you to impose dastardly deeds upon persons simply because you are of the same race as the person that you are assaulting. The truth is, if you assault and target a person because of race, it doesn't matter what your race is. You are committing a hate crime. The truth is, you can be of the same race and commit a hate crime. The victim and the perpetrator can be of the same race and you will still have a hate crime. We need to rid ourselves of this foolish notion that this law was passed in some way to assault persons who are of an ethnicity or a race that we have traditionally in this country found to be engaged in some of these kinds of activities. It's not targeted at any given race. It's targeted at people who commit crimes against other people simply because of who these people are. And I remind you, injustice against any one of us is a threat to justice for every one of us. And we all have a duty to make sure that we don't send out some silly notion that this law was designed for one race of people. This law was designed for every person who would commit a hate crime against another person. So I'm saddened to say this morning that the bad news is Mr. Johnson had to fight off several persons, stood his ground for 10 minutes, but indicated that he thought he was going to die as they assaulted him. That's the bad news. The good news is that the law has worked, that this law is bringing new meaning to the notion of justice for all. And this law will not allow those who would commit dastardly deeds and be prosecuted in state courts for misdemeanors to go unchecked. They will now face felony charges in our federal courts. This is the way it should be in the greatest country in the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. God bless all listening, and God bless the United States of America.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As United Consent to 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come to the floor again to continue to identify and educate you, Mr. Speaker, on the various locations where we store high-level nuclear waste around this country and the various positions that our colleagues on the other chamber have voted either for or against, in hopes that eventually the public will become well-informed and that they will take the action through their elected officials to do even what the Blue Ribbon Commission suggested, which is decide and locate a long-term geological storage facility. Now, this is not new. We've been doing it for decades. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act was established in 1982. The amendments were passed through this chamber, signed into law in 1987, which identified a long-term geological repository at a place called Yucca Mountain in the desert in Nevada. So what I've been attempting to do throughout this past year and a half, I chair a subcommittee that has direct responsibility for this, is identify different locations. So today we go to a place very close here. In fact, I think it's only 43 miles from the District of Columbia, and that's a place called Calvert Cliffs. And I like to compare and contrast it with where we should be storing our long-term, in a long-term geological repository, where our nuclear waste should be stored, not in a decade or two from now, but at this very moment where it should be. So Calvert Cliffs is in Maryland, and in Calvert Cliffs there are 1,300 metric tons of uranium of spent fuel on site, versus Yucca Mountain, which is a mountain in a desert where we have no nuclear waste on site. At Calvert Cliffs, this nuclear waste, spent nuclear fuel, is stored above the ground in pools and in casks above the ground, where if it was stored in Yucca Mountain, it would be 1,000 feet underground. Calvert Cliffs, the nuclear waste is stored 85 feet above the groundwater, where at Yucca Mountain it would be 1,000 feet above the water table. And finally, at Yucca Mountain, the nearest body of water is the Colorado River, about 100 miles. Well, as you can see here in this photo, Calvert Cliffs is right next to Chesapeake Bay. Now, Yucca Mountain is about 90 miles from Las Vegas, maybe 100 miles from Las Vegas. Calvert Cliffs is straight line 43 miles from Washington, D.C. So what are the senators from the surrounding areas, how have they voted? You would think they wouldn't want high-level nuclear waste stored next to Chesapeake Bay, 43 miles from the capital city. Well, Senator Carper has voted no in 2002. Senator Coons, new member, we don't know his position. That's part of coming down here. I'm pretty sure that if the majority leader of the Senate would call a vote and this issue was thoroughly debated, it would pass on the floor of the Senate, because we have a lot of senators who have yet to declare their position. Here, Senator Cardin, a former member of the House, had voted yea in 2002 for Yucca Mountain. Senator Mikulski, same year, different chamber, voted no. So how does our national tally go? Well, currently, we believe 47 U.S. senators who have a stated position in support of Yucca Mountain. We have over 16 that have never cast a vote or declared their position on what we do with high-level nuclear waste, either spent fuel or nuclear waste in the processing of nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. We have 19 who've had a position of no at some time in their career. So it's very, very important to continue this debate, Mr. Speaker, to continue to come down on the floor to talk about the federal law as is today. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act was passed in 1982. The amendment was agreed to in 1987. The amendment identified Yucca Mountain as our long-term geological repository to store high-level nuclear waste. The time is well past since we should be doing this. In fact, we actually pay utilities to hold their nuclear waste since it's our responsibility to take the waste. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Berkeley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I rise to address the House for 5 minutes and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I'm here to talk about the Buffett bill, but I just cannot allow what Mr. Shimkus has just said to go unresponded to because it's such an important issue for the people of the state of Nevada. The so-called Nuclear Act that he discussed that was passed in '82 and amended in '87 is known in Nevada as the Screw Nevada Bill. And let me tell you what it is. It's a proposal that would ship 77,000 tons of toxic radioactive nuclear waste across 43 states to be buried in a hole in the Nevada desert, which is 90 miles from a major population center of Las Vegas, where we have groundwater issues, seismic activity, and volcanic activity. The EPA cannot come up with any radiation standards that would protect the people of the state of Nevada or anyone else in this country. Let me tell you, originally when they came up with this nonsensical plan, which is purely political, has nothing to do with science, they said that we could store the rods, the nuclear waste, in Yucca Mountain with no problem, leave it bare. Then we realized that that wouldn't work because of the groundwater. So then we decided that they would put the nuclear waste in canisters. But what do you know? There's no canisters that currently exist that can safely store this stuff. So then they came up with shields that would go around the canisters that don't exist to be put into Yucca Mountain. And then the last Republican Secretary of Energy talked about an army of robots that would walk down Yucca Mountain and be able to check on the nuclear waste while it's leaking and leaching into the groundwater. It's a ridiculous proposal, and it's time to go to Plan B, because Plan A isn't going to happen. 77% of the people of the state of Nevada do not want nuclear waste stored at Yucca Mountain. End of that. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my deep disappointment with yesterday's vote in the United States Senate. Once again, Senate Republicans sided with Wall Street millionaires against the interests of struggling middle-class families throughout Nevada. The Buffett rule is simple and it's common sense. It means if you're a housekeeper or a nurse, a blackjack dealer or a waitress or any other middle-class professional, you shouldn't pay higher tax rates than multimillionaires who own yachts and travel in private jets. It means that if you're a Nevadan living paycheck to paycheck, you shouldn't be carrying the burden for Wall Street hedge fund managers and big oil company executives. The senators who voted against basic tax fairness yesterday need to spend a little more time prioritizing the needs of hard-working Nevadans. They're struggling. These are the people that are struggling to put food on the table, to fill up their cars with gas, and to pay their mortgage or their rent. The fact that the wealthiest people in this country pay their taxes at a lower tax rate than their secretaries and their chauffeurs doesn't pass the smell test. It stinks. And that's why I'm proud to announce that I'm a co-sponsor of the Buffett rule in the House, and I urge all of my colleagues to join me, and let's bring some fundamental tax fairness to the people of the United States of America. 72% of the American people agree with me that the Buffett rule should be made into law, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Dole, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just minutes ago, I had an opportunity to be outside and see the space shuttle flying around the United States Capitol on its way to Dulles, which brought back memories. Certainly those that are study of history realize that back in the 60s it was President Kennedy who said that the United States will take a man and deliver him to the moon and bring him safely back to the earth, which consequently took off the space race at that point in time, and literally hundreds of thousands of people became more engaged in science and technology, engineering and mathematics, something that I think that we need to rekindle today. Mr. Speaker, I represent one of the largest manufacturing districts in the United States. And when I tour small businesses throughout the 10th District of Illinois, employers continually tell me that they've got job openings available, yet they can't find people, individuals, workers, able to fill those roles that need to be filled by those that have taken science and technology, engineering and mathematics courses, or the STEM fields. In the depths of this recession that we have been going through, Manufacturing Association has statistics that say 600,000 jobs across our nation went unfilled. They went unfilled because not enough people were trained in the STEM fields. These are not low-paying jobs, Mr. Speaker. These jobs, on average, pay $77,000 annually. We must empower our students and job seekers to pursue STEM education so that they can fill these good, high-paying jobs right here at home. Certainly one of the pillars of my Main Street Jobs agenda is that of STEM education. If we can prepare our students and those that are looking for work, we can help empower these people to find good-paying jobs and keep our manufacturing and innovation right here at home. The College of Lake County, a college in my district, has teamed up with local manufacturers to help provide education that is necessary in the STEM fields for those who are unemployed or wanting to pursue a manufacturing career. I'm pleased to say that one of the local manufacturers actually went to the College of Lake County and said, we're actually pulling students from Iowa and Ohio. Is there any way you might be able to offer courses here at the College of Lake County so that we could start hiring people locally to fill these jobs? They were all too happy to oblige. I recently held a STEM field trip where I took interested students from high schools all across the 10th District to different high-tech organizations in the region. These students learned how they can apply their education firsthand and pursue advanced careers in this field. Just last week, I hosted the first ever Manufacturing and Education Summit to bridge the gap between educators and manufacturers. We had folks from high schools and colleges. We had manufacturers there trying to say what was it that they needed, what were they looking for in students that were going to be graduating from either high school or college. This is exactly what we need to be doing right now. One of the success stories of bridging the gap between education and manufacturing is that of Wheeling High School principal Dr. Laz Lopez. He's worked with local businesses to find out what the actual needs are in the community and offering students options in pursuing a STEM education. Today, Dr. Lopez has been recognized as starting one of the most successful STEM high schools in our country. Just this last Friday, I joined him and other STEM students from various high schools around the area while they competed in a STEM competition, focusing on nanotechnology and high-powered computing. These are extraordinarily bright students who are better prepared for the 21st century workforce. STEM education is and should be a bipartisan idea. I believe that this is an area of common ground and that we should be promoting local efforts all across our nation to help manufacturers fill open jobs and better prepare our emerging workforce for 21st century careers. We must not stand idly by and hope that this happens. Rather, we must be proactive and work to spur our local economy by demonstrating the success of STEM education. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics is one way we can help spur our economy to get our country back to work. I would encourage my colleagues to get involved in their local schools and communities, local colleges, to find out more on how they can better prepare students for a career in the 21st century through STEM education. It was not too long ago that John Kennedy gave us a charge to bring a man to the moon and safely back to this earth. Spurring on STEM education, we have to do it again today. We have to make sure that we have that pipeline of students to be able to take jobs right here at home. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
I have to address the House for 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Let me thank the Speaker for his kindness in yielding this morning. And I join my colleague that just spoke on the vitality and the importance of STEM education as a 12-year member of the Science Committee. And I also had a sense of emotion as Discovery flew many times over this great institution, democratic institution. And that emotion compels me to continue to fight for a place for one of the shuttles in the hometown of which it was born, the place where John F. Kennedy spoke at the Rice Hotel and inspired us to go into space, and that is Houston, Texas, NASA Johnson. I look forward to that continued bipartisan effort to have an appropriate representation of the 4 shuttles back in Houston where they belong. I rise today as well to speak about a number of things, and Mr. Speaker, I will try to ensure that I include them within the time allotted. But I believe it's important to sort of look at, for my colleagues, a series of issues. I support the Buffett rule not because I believe in any kind of class warfare. I celebrate capitalism and applaud Mr. Buffett and others. But it is a good way to raise revenue and bring down the deficit. We, of course, will be dealing with a bill proposed by my Republican friends on the other side of the aisle. And the only thing that they will do is enhance the pocket money of people who don't need it. There is an unfairness in the tax code. I would join in a bipartisan way to look at it. I would hope that we would be able, in making the tax code fair, to bring down the deficit. But the bill that we will see, as I said, will increase the pocket change of millionaires. It'll be a job killer. And, of course, it will cut the Medicare guarantees of those who have worked hard for their children and grandchildren. I cannot support legislation that isn't fair and balanced. And I would plead to my colleagues to find the middle ground, a fair tax code, bringing down the deficit. I would encourage them to look at H.R. 3710, an energy bill for someone, myself, who's practiced oil and gas law for 15 years. It addresses the question of the wetlands. It uses exploration dollars to bring down the deficit, and it allows an expanded exploration in the Gulf region. Process that has been vetted by many energy organizations, energy companies, and they believe that is a bipartisan approach. H.R. 3710 is ready for the combined work of all of us. I also believe it's important to speak about the value of education in several ways. And I'm here today to join in H.R. 3826, proudly so, that stands with students who now carry the bulk of the debt in America. Credit debt. Students who are simply trying to do as my colleague just said, study the science, technology, engineering, and math. In about 74 days, the interest rates on Stafford loans will double, triple to 6.8%. You may have borrowed at 2%, and here we are talking about it going up to 6.8%. I, with every fiber in my body, stand against that. I'm going to stand with the students and parents who have children in school. We can win this thing. We must have a legislative action to stop that stealing of money from our children who are simply trying to be in the best colleges, the state colleges, to be educated. Parents, wake up. In 74 days, the interest rates on your children's loans are going up to 6.8%. Call our offices. Get on our websites. Beg us to pass H.R. 3826 by my good friend Mr. Courtney from Connecticut. Please, I beg of you, and I will be there with you, from the Texas Southern University to the University of Houston to Houston Baptist to the Houston Community College. We're going to work this. Let me also move very quickly, Mr. Speaker, to the fact that this is the 5th commemoration of the terrible killings of Texas Tech. And this Congress has been charged with being fearful of dealing with gun legislation. Over the years, I have introduced the Child Gun Safety and Gun Access Bill. I have, in fact, supported bills dealing with gun checks to close gun loopholes at gun shows. I have supported bills to stop the proliferation of assault weapons, not bills against the Second Amendment, but bills that would have stopped Mr. Zimmerman from recklessly walking around with a 9mm, and he was only supposed to be the eyes and ears of his neighborhood. Mr. Speaker, I join in a bipartisan manner, even to the extent of saying we must clean up the Secret Service. I support Mr. Sullivan, and even clean up the GSA, because Gilbane, who has received stimulus dollars by the GSA, has refused to be diverse. To the CEO of Gilbane, this congressperson you need to call, you are an unfair company, and you're using federal dollars to the GSA in an inappropriate way. No diverse workforce
time has expired.
And no small business. Mr. Speaker, I thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I come to the floor today with heavy heart and sadness as we honor another fallen soldier, but also to honor the life and legacy of Staff Sergeant Joseph DeAugustine, young man from Waldwick, New Jersey. This young man was killed just recently, on March 27, 2012, while conducting combat operations in Afghanistan. You know, it was just one day after graduating from Waldwick High School, this young man enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. After that, he was assigned to the 8th Engineer Support Battalion, the 2nd Marine Logistics Group, the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, and all this time he served over 2 years, or 2 tours of duties, I should say, in Iraq, and he was just 2 weeks away, only 2 weeks away, from completing this, his 2nd tour of duty in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant DeAugustine worked as an explosive ordnance disposal tech. What does that mean? That means that he went ahead of the other soldiers, of the other Marines, of the other sailors, of the other airmen. And he was the one that cleared the way for them so they could go on and do their work. And so it was with this greatest act of sacrifice possible, Staff Sergeant Augustine, he gave his life while protecting his fellow men and women in uniform. He was just 29 years old. Now, we're never going to know the numerous number of lives that he was able to save in his work. But, you know, the tremendous outpouring of love and support that we have seen for his family in the days since his death perhaps provided maybe a glimpse into the number of people that he touched in his short life. So to those people who knew him best, his parents, Anthony and Patricia, to his sisters, Nicole, Jennifer, Michelle, to his brother-in-law, Len, to all of them he was, well, a loving son, a loving brother, and he will be remembered as such. To his many friends that he grew up with in high school and what have you, he remembered as his good guy, a friend by his nickname, Dago. To his fellow Marines, he remembered as a what? As a brother-in-arms in the service. And to all of us here now who are just maybe hearing his name for the first time, to America. To Americans, he will be remembered as a patriot, as a man who loved his country, who loved the Marine Corps, as a man who gave his life for all of us, for protecting our freedoms and our liberties in this country. Let us remember this young man. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As co-founder and co-chair of the Congressional Out of Poverty Caucus, I rise today to continue talking about the tide of poverty that impacts every single district all across our country. I rise to call on all of my colleagues to come together to reignite the American dream for all Americans by helping to create the millions of new jobs that they so desperately need. Mr. Speaker, Social Security, Medicare, and the critical benefits to feed hungry children in America did not cause our deficits. Our nation's debt is a direct result of the Republicans' two unfunded wars, their failed economic policies, and the totally failed oversight of the financial services sector by the Bush administrative regulators. And giving more tax cuts to the super rich and their corporations will only make the deficits worse and will do nothing to grow our economy. Mr. Speaker, let's not pass another $46 billion loophole for the wealthy 1%. Mr. Cantor's H.R. 9 is yet another tax holiday that would only increase the deficit and will fail to create new jobs. We should be passing laws that protect the health and safety of our nation's most vulnerable, like our children and our seniors. We must pass laws that provide some relief for the millions of Americans still struggling to find a good job. Mr. Speaker, any so-called jobless recovery where you and your family are still out of work is really no recovery at all. That is why we simply cannot seek to balance the budget on the backs of the poor and our seniors and struggling families across America. The Republican budget, the Ryan budget, seeks to do just that. Actually, the Republican budget really is not serious about balancing the budget at all. Their budget guts, mind you, guts food stamps for our families in a time of such desperate need. It cripples Medicaid and ends Medicare as we know it today. Their budgets make these draconian cuts not to balance the budget, but to create even more tax giveaways to millionaires and to massive corporations. Mr. Speaker, we can do better than blame the poor and the powerless for the greed and the corruption of the rich and powerful. We can do better, and we must do better for all of the American people. And we can protect the most vulnerable Americans, grow our economy, and reduce our deficits. Critical programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, better known as SNAP, not only feeds hungry children and families, but it supports the overall economy. Every dollar of SNAP benefits generates $1.84 in our economic activity. SNAP benefits reduces long-term health care costs, improves the educational performance of children, and helps to stabilize and improve the long-term economic outcomes of the families who receive these benefits. All of those positive outcomes help boost the entire economy from top to bottom. If people are able to buy a little more in the grocery store, someone has to grow it, pack it, and ship it. All of those things lead directly to more jobs. So making cuts on struggling families during hard times is not only heartless and mean and immoral, but it also makes no sense because it doesn't reduce the deficit. Mr. Speaker, there is a proposal to get our fiscal house in order even while we protect American families and invest in a stronger and more prosperous future. The Congressional Progressive Caucus budget, the Budget for All, would do just that. This budget makes smart and targeted cuts that preserve our national security, protect Social Security and Medicare, and extend and expand critical unemployment benefits for millions of Americans, including those who have hit 99 weeks where they're no longer eligible. These are the people who are still struggling to find a good job. The Budget for All would ask that the wealthiest 1% and the world's biggest corporations pay their fair share so that we can afford to invest in our children's future and grow our economy. America cannot afford another year of inaction and bills that pander to narrow special interests. Let's pass the President's American Jobs Act and pass a robust transportation bill that will fund our nation's critical infrastructure priorities, fund green public transportation projects, and create real jobs. It's time that we all come together to put Americans back to work. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Request 5 minutes to address, revise, and extend.